morning, everybody. And allow me to welcome you to the session Circular Economy in Construction. My name is Elisa Tonda, and I'm heading a team in the UN Environment Programme working on the agenda of sustainable consumption and production. And today I'll take you through a journey to discover how circularity is being embedded in the building and construction sector and in the built environment across the globe. And together with you, we will reflect what it entails embedding circular economy in the building and construction sector, in a sector whose products have really a very long lifetime, products that are associated with significant investment, in a sector which, as we all know, has significant potentials by embedding circularity, not only to tackle a challenge related to the pressure that the sector is posing on natural resources, but has also enormous potential to address and to provide positive solutions to climate change, specifically through climate mitigation. And in helping us frame the session, frame the discussion that we will have today during the session, I have the honor to welcome here on the stage the keynote speech deliverer for this session, Martin Stucci, who is the co-founder and managing director of Systemic, an organization which has in its DNA the identification of systemic solutions to address climate challenges related to circular materials and sustainable land use. Martin, it's an honor to give you the floor, and thank you very much for joining us in the session.
Thank you, Eliza. Thanks a lot. Well, welcome to the construction session, which, if we believe in numbers, is the most important one, which is probably the most daunting one, which is more probably, or even certainly, the most unresolved one, but it might also be a very hopeful one if we can agree on that ending. Where are we? 1.5 days into the World Circular Economy Forum. So I think we all agree that the current use of resources is problematic. We are using 90 billion tons every year in order to drive our prosperity engine. That is worth about 50% of greenhouse gas emissions that we know. It's worth about 80% of the biodiversity effects that we are aware of. It has all kinds of other negative effects, problematic effects on health, on the resilience of our communities, also on equality. So I think we agree on that. I think secondly, we agree that increasingly the concept of the circular economy starts getting accepted as a coherent strategy to respond to the resource challenge that we have in front of us. Well, then I think we also accept that the current rate of change, or even the direction of change, is just not right. That has to do with political barriers, but it also has increasingly to do with social barriers and social resistance that we run into, and that can wear all kinds of colors. In France, it wears the color yellow. In my country, it wears the color blue. But we do have to understand that there are parts of the population that already are overwhelmed by acceleration, and what we are preaching here is, again, the acceleration of an agenda. We need to acknowledge that. Well, and then lastly, I think we found out that there is hope, because there are some pockets where we see change, but particularly we see that change where there are immediate pressure points. Plastic, there's an immediate pressure point. I think in the car industry, car batteries, there's an immediate pressure point, because it's not entirely clear where we'll be getting our resources from for that new technology. Food waste might also be accepted as one of those pressure points. Now, if that is true, and if we translate that to our exam question here, construction, then I think it's fair to say that all of that applies in a big way. Sort of resources, 50% of the resource challenge actually has to do with built environment. We are clearly not on track in order to cities, and the way we are constructing is not getting more circular, it's getting less circular. And let's be very very honest, and let's also discuss that, we don't really have a pressure point. Sort of what is the pressure point to make construction more circular in a way that really is supported by, by public opinion and political trends. However, there might be, there's one trend out there which I will later on call the mesoeconomy, which in fact might come to our rescue. I have been asked to frame the discussion around the construction sector within the context of the circular economy. Here's one attempt. I think we are currently facing two narratives out there. The one narrative we are all quite familiar with, and some of you might have read Steven Pinker, Enlightenment Now. I think there's one direction of thought here which wants to believe that we are just continuing on the back of enlightenment, on the back of scientific principles, on the back of technology. We are continuing to improve almost every aspect of economic, social, and human life. And for the last 200 years, we have seen that trend, and the GDP line here on this chart is showing that we are always on our way up. And nothing will stop us. I think there is a fault in that narrative, chapter 13, where they also say that where Steven Pinker also says that biological systems in the way are also progressing because we start investing more into them. I think that's not right. There's a second narrative right here, which IRP and UNEP have made quite clear, which is that there is another side of the coin, and the other side of the coin are the natural capital costs that we are paying for that progress that we are seeing. So there is the other side of the coin that we have to be aware of. And conceptually, we do know, and that's the emblem of the International Resource Panel that we have the privilege to work with very closely. That's the emblem. There is a conceptual way out, which is decoupling, triple decoupling in the way we are making sure well-being is being decoupled from economic activity is being decoupled from resource use is being decoupled from the environmental impacts that we see. That's the world we want to see. We can describe it conceptually. The problem, however, is we don't see it in reality. Ever since the mid-90s, we have taken a different course. In a world where Kuznets, some of you might be aware of the classical Kuznets debate, that as we grow rich, we grow cleaner, that the Kuznets effect is not hitting us, at least not strongly enough. While some economies might get more resource productive, as we shift towards those economies that are less resource productive, overall resource productivity is coming down at a moment where we need it to come up very, very fast. That's the dilemma in which we sit. And we need to find an answer for that, and just growing ourselves green, growing through Kuznets cannot be the answer. We need to have a different conceptual answer altogether, and that happens to be the concept of the circular economy. That's why we are here. It's, by the way, one of the charts that at least I'm quite proud of. We drew it, 8 or 9 years ago. It has been downloaded, I think, Joss, are you here? 10 million times in the meantime. It has made its way. And luckily, a few years ago, 2014, Janez, the European Commission started asking a very good question. Could this be an alternative development path for us altogether? Is this attractive for Europe to move into a circular economy? To do what other countries call ecological civilization, China, smart prosperity, Canada, resource efficiency, Japan, to have our own European pathway of decoupling ourselves from resources with all the economic benefits? Or are we paying an extra price in a continent where industry already pays an extra burden because we are so resource dependent? So can we afford it or can we not afford it? And we had the chance to put our lock in the fire at the day, Ellen MacArthur, myself, and try to present a vision of what a Europe actually on the back of that system could look like. And we talked about all the structured waste that's currently baked into an economy as mature as the European one. Just think about cars. There's the classical example how a car is only 2% utilized because it's parked most of the time, because it's only 20% of the potential energy that we translate into kinetic energy, of how it's using and clogging up our cities. We told the same story about the food system. system where only 5% of the nutrients actually make it into the human body and only 10% of the water is properly utilized. And then we stumbled over the built environment. And that quite took me. It's a very, very interesting case that we jointly have to resolve today. I mean, first of all, it's huge. This is 10% of the investment that we do in the European Union. It's bigger than all the industrial investments altogether. Who would have thought? I wasn't aware of that. It's very, very big. And secondly, it's the single biggest household spend. Everything that you put into your household living, into your apartment, into your house, and that you need in order to equip it, that's about 25% of net income in Europe, and that's about a 10,000 euro bill for a family a year. So it's substantial. And because it's substantial, being well housed actually drives many into strain or into poverty. So there is 100 million urban households that is globally financially unstretched. There's 235 million which actually have to live in substandard housing. And as you might expect, even by 2025, huge numbers will be added to those in demand of affordable low-income housing. So it's a huge driver of social stability within our society. In the face of that, who would have thought, and I was quite flabbergasted when we started to work on that, sort of there is so much structural waste in the construction and the built environment system, even today. So it's the sector which sort of improves its productivity only at a quarter of the rate of the rest of the economy. That has been a pattern for years. It's not advancing as fast as other sectors when it comes to productivity. 15% of the materials are wasted even during the construction process. But once you have built it, you have got a built environment that you are not utilizing. So there's 60% of an office is typically not utilized. Many of the residential dwellers, in fact, say they are living in space that's much too big for them, but they have no way to reduce themselves flexibly. Then, of course, there is a major waste of energy. Then there is a very poor implementation of building standards, even if you can demonstrate that this can be profitably done. That's how inefficient markets actually operate in the built environment sector. And then finally, there is all that stuff. Sort of given it's 50% of all the materials we take in use. After only one use cycle, we don't know what to do with it. 54% of European waste is in fact demolition waste, which is anything between worthless or hazardous. Now, so much waste built into the system. Then we had the chance to look for an alternative. And we took the Resolve framework, which we like a lot, which looks at the 6 different levers that you have to build resource decoupled system: regenerate, share, optimize, loop, virtualize, and exchange. And every single time you find very innovative, business-savvy solutions in order to provide better built environment by shifting to renewable energy or building materials, by sharing, of course, both the building equipment, but then later on also the building stock that we have generated, by starting to apply some of the normal standard lean industrial production processes to construction, which is still very far from that today. Then, of course, by making sure that materials stay in the loop once the building is being demolished, by making sure we need less in the first place, because there is something like teleworking today, and you might not need a building in the first place, or by applying completely new completely new models in the way we think about construction, like 3D printed buildings, which is increasingly a possibility. So there is an alternative, and then we looked into it, and I'm not taking you through this. In every one of those Resolve models that we looked at, we found, in fact, thriving businesses that make a very good living just on the back of those different Resolve levers that already exist in the building industry. But here's the catch. The catch is that we need to optimize, to improve, and to circularize the built environment space as a system. Historically, we do know that product innovation always travels faster than systems innovation. So we don't need a supercar, we need a new mobility system. We don't need superfood, we need a new food system. We don't need a super house. or a super material. We need a built environment system in which everything is integrated, from the way we are treating land, from the way we are building our houses, from the way we are integrating biosystems back into the city, from the way we are applying passive architecture, from the way we are sharing, towards the way we are creating walkabilities within our communities. So that is is there a chance for us actually to arrive at this target picture of a built environment that is organized by circular design? Well, we have to, because the construction waste or the resources that go into our built environment are just so huge. It's a 25 gigaton item today, and it's in 2060, it might easily be a 55 gigaton item. And that comes, as you might imagine, with a massive carbon load. So the built environment alone will emit or will be related to emissions worth about 500 billion tons by 2050. And those of you who are on top of the Paris Agreement know that's about the budget that we have overall. So the built environment alone would use it if we were continuing in the business as usual way. Now, that's one pressure point. Another pressure point is the fact that buildings are also causing a lot of air, or the construction sector alone is using or emitting a lot of air pollution, and so there's a very strong health reason also to rethink the way we do construction. Here's an example for the UK, where you can in fact demonstrate that the built environment is worth about 42% of, even in a very advanced country, 42% of the entire carbon load that comes with the entire economy. About 50 million tons of that is related to construction, but then even more of that is related to the way we are using it, both energetically and in our day-to-day life. Now, we need to get out of that, and we need to get out of that very fast. And so you would want to see an industry that is actually developing very fast and very high up on its industry maturity curve. That's not what we see. The entire concept of the circular construction industry and its embeddedness into the built environment is still a project-based industry. Whoever wants to go for eco-kiln materials, you will have to go for singular in-trial, pre-commercial projects in order to find your solution. Whoever wants to buy a ho-ho in Vienna, you will have to go for someone who does that almost the first time. If you want to go for a circle house in Denmark, again, this is a first of its kind project. If you want to go for the headquarter in Aleander, again, it's a first of a kind project. If you want to go for limestone calcinated cement, again, this is a first of its kind. We have to consider that with this whole circular construction agenda, we're at a very early end of the maturity curve. We are not in a mature industry yet. So how to make it an industry? I think one of the very big things that happens to be in our way, that we haven't got our mind around what we are solving for. We are trying to solve for the circular construction sector, whilst really we are solving, we need to solve for two very distinct problems. And it's the work of IRP again that I'm referring to, which actually tells us that you need to think brownfield and you need to think greenfield. Brownfield is entirely different from greenfield. Brownfield, all the OECD countries, they have their building stock in place. So here you have completely different levers in order to optimize it and make it more resource independent. And the biggest lever happens to be the sharing and the fluidity of space. It's completely different in greenfield, where we see a massive explosion of the urban and of the building stock, where we will see the 70% urbanized world in 2060. And here it's very very much about the right construction and building technologies, materials, and then also the right urban footprint. These are two different problems. And we also need to seek for two different pressure points in order to make this agenda relevant in a brownfield world and in a greenfield world. In the brownfield world, we could easily show that if we were to solve for greenhouse gases, so there is we need where we, in order to be in line with with even the 2-degree scenario, we need to find ways to get rid of 46 million gigatons until 2050. And whatever currently we do with levers of the circular economy, and let's please face it, there's one gap of about 8 gigatons that will be filled, which is the biggest one that one could be found, which can be filled by sharing buildings better. But then there is a huge rest that we don't have a good answer for. So what are we learning from that? That greenhouse gas and climate change can't be the trigger to rebuild our brownfield cities into a construction circular economy, painful as it is. But we need to be aware of it. We need to look for another pressure point in order to get us there. It's different for the greenfield world where we are building the new cities. Here we have to learn that we have to design them differently from the get-go and not design that much resource use and spatial sprawl into that in the first place. That alone, if you take those two examples between Atlanta and Barcelona, takes 5 tons of carbon emission out of everyone's footprint every year. So what's our answer for the sprawling, still to be built cities around the world? Again, IRP found, as far as I'm concerned, a very interesting answer here. They are defining the high productive new city of the future, which is called the circular urban metabolism, as one that actually has 5 design criteria that make it resource independent, highly livable, and resilient. First, you need to invest into density. It's the only way to be energy productive, resource productive, and to have the optimal flow and the optimal use of your building stock. Secondly, you have to make sure it's diverse in the way you use it within that density. Thirdly, you have to make sure that you are reintegrating the biosphere back into the city. Then the fourth one is you have to make sure that because a big part of our mobility these days is internodal, that is accessible, and then you need to organize a lot of micro-mobility back into the city, which is something that you see in Helsinki all around you. So here are 5 design criteria in which all of a sudden, if you inject your circular buildings into it, they actually are very effective and resource decoupled, but you have to do that within a blueprint. And now the question is, where do we get our pressure point from? We don't get it from just the climate debate. We don't just get it from the land use debate. We don't get it just from the mobility and this security debate. We get it from all of those. And that's why cities might be our best hope, because it's within cities where the mesoeconomy, which is different from traditional decision-making on a macro level, national, or on a micro level through markets, where the arrangement of different parties is happening more effective than in any other area of society. And the circular promise is particularly attractive to what we would call the entrepreneurial urban governance, which is the city of the future. And you asked me to first stop on time, and I almost did, and secondly to stop on a hopeful note. And that was my attempt to end on a hopeful note. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Martin, for having framed the discussion for us so clearly and for having helped us introduce the concept of pressure points, the driver for scaling up, for bringing circularity into the sector, as well as for having given us a glance that there are a lot of innovations, a lot of solutions that need to be taken care to reach their status of maturity and to really influence and transform fully the sector. And what will happen in the rest of the session is that we will be running into deep dives in what is happening in a number of regions to really understand how the idea of circularity is embedded in the built environment. But prior to doing so, I'll add another element of the puzzle of the context of this conversation. The session has been thought by the conveners, by the organizer of the session, who are the Ministry of Environment of Finland, the Sustainable Building and Construction Program of the One Planet Network, and ourselves in the UN Environment Program. It has been conceived as an opportunity to give additional elements and inspiration to advance some of the activities that are materializing in the context of the One Planet Network. The One Planet Network is a partnership, a platform that brings together actors that are working to accelerate progress towards Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is focusing on sustainable consumption and production. Actors across different sectors, different constituencies, but with a vision of providing input to transform our societies into embedding more circularity into production and consumption. And this is happening through 6 priorities, topics that are considered as really transformational in the impact that they can achieve. And one of these sectoral areas is indeed the one of sustainable building and construction. And just to give you a snapshot of the community and the platform that is gathered around that program, you will see here in the slide an overview of the countries, the 23 countries that are represented in the program through 70 partners that are bringing together in an almost equal way both national and local government, as well as the business community, research institution and academia, as well as civil society organizations, all of them bringing the top expertise in the building and construction sector under the leadership of 3 organizations that are convening and nurturing that program, being the Ministry of Environment of Finland, again the UN Environment Program, and Remit University. The purpose of this community is currently to really accelerate in finding solutions and delivering impact across 3 focus themes of the program, being the sustainable and resilient building practices, sustainably sourced material, and not surprisingly, the third one is circular built environment. Therefore, all the ideas and all the inspiration that will emerge from our discussion of today will really be a direct feed into the program to bring the ideas and recommendation of this forum into scaling up at a global level the agenda of circularity in the built environment. And as said, we are now going to somehow move a little bit across the globe and get a sense of how circularity and circular economy has been embedded in the built environment in different geographic regions. And I will start by giving the floor to the first expert who will be taking us through this trip. The first expert is Ms. Zinat Niazi, who is the Vice President of Development Alternative Group based in India, but she will give us really a perspective across the Asian region of where do we stand in embedding circularity in the built environment. Zinat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisa. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Ministry of Environment, Government of Finland, that has given us the opportunity to be here and to be able to do this deep dive in the last few months, do the study. And I would like to start by actually thanking Martin because of the 2 points that you made in your presentation. One, about looking at the fact that materials have taken center stage, and it's taken us almost 3 or 4 decades of pushing, and I think the IRP has a lot to contribute into that, of bringing that to the forefront, but also being able to articulate the distinction between the brownfield and the greenfield, which brings the regions that we are talking into concentration right into focus. So that being the case, and I hope I know how to use this, yeah. So let me get you into the Asian context. Very quick snapshot. We are looking at a region which is home to a huge population and a huge urban population, or a growing urban population, I should say, and it has the fastest rate of urban growth in the world. And within Asia, Southeast Asia is actually the region which is growing even faster. China is subject to a phenomenon of ghost town. So after you've reached a certain space, you actually are seeing in China a phenomenon of emptying towns. So there's a troubling situation that we are seeing there. But we do know that all of Asia is going to be over 50% urban by 2030. And between 2016 and 2030, that's the change within that rectangle that you see, yet there is going to be a considerable rural population still. And so materials which are related to both need to be addressed. India will triple its, in Asia, India and China are the countries to really look at. In terms of the quantum of space that they're going to be adding, India is going to triple its floor area, urban floor area, and China is going to double its floor area by 2050. So this is the scale that we are talking about. In order to understand what's happening there, we need to see what's the character of the stock at the moment and how the stock is changing, because we want to see what's going to happen to the materials. And we are seeing the region going to be using about 80 billion tons of materials by 2050. Most of this material, incidentally, is going to come from the non-metallic mineral ores, and it's not really the biomass that is increasing in the construction sector, it's going to be the minerals. And the shifts will mean from, we have a situation, this is a graph which is telling us about the kind of dwelling types in the Asian region, and we see that there is a shift also from the houses to apartments, which means that you are looking at a different materiality of building material. A lot of the new stock is not going to be made out of biomass. It is going to come out of concretes and other minerals. And that is where, in the future, we might want to see recovery and recycling potential, not really now. You see the characteristics here. A lot of the shift in India, ASEAN, other Asian region is really going to be in the concretes that we will see the most of the material. The drivers, and I'll quickly go through the next few slides, the drivers in this region, the brownfield or the greenfield space, are growth, which is material energy efficiency is what we are looking at. So urbanization is driving us. Consumption patterns, so there is a huge aspiring middle class that is driving the change. And this is where we probably need recycling, reuse, refurbishment. The environmental impact is a question that we are faced with, not just from the pollution end, but also from the extraction of materials end of the value chain. And the extraction of material leads us to the fact that there is a resource criticality. The resource criticality is not just because there is scarcity, but also it's now conflicting with other sectors. Specifically, we look at the food security food system, because you have housing and urbanization having an impact on land, but also on the extraction of soils for brick making and others is having an impact on the agricultural land and the productivity of land there. And what is not really seen is because of the demography and the population in the Asian region, it is employment and entrepreneurship potential also which has a drive, which is not seen very much in the circular economy space, but that is where I think one of the opportunities also lies. There are a lot of countries who have started their varied policies and programs. The governments are looking at it. I think China was the first one. We now have a deep discussion even in India, which is looking at a policy which is starting from resource efficiency, but very much focused on circularity. And of course, there are the others, Japan, Vietnam, etc. But the strategies which really, when we took a deep dive, we realized that the things that we are looking at are public procurement, are data disclosures by product manufacturers, construction agencies. There's very little information available on what really goes into building material, and that is not available. Innovation in design for assembly and regenerative systems. We noticed in the beginning that the biomass materials are not increasing, but that's probably a space where the opportunity lies. I have a few slides which talk about what's happening in the region at the moment. Some examples. This comes from India, where we see an industrial symbiosis of waste from the power industry, from the thermal power plants, being converted into building blocks and into buildings through an entrepreneurial route. We have another example, again from India, and Martin, you mentioned it, which is the low-carbon cement, low-carbon calcined cement, and there is the whole process. In fact, this now in India is in pre-commercial production stage already. We have from China the very interesting example of converting debris, and where they have huge quantities of debris, into full buildings through 3D printing at that scale. And a similar example that was suggested for Nepal. I do not think it has yet been applied. It has been applied in Haiti, but not in Nepal, but it has been suggested, which is the use of debris from the earthquake waste. So there's a lot of debris into small-scale block production conversion. Very interesting. In fact, the technology comes from Netherlands. Then you have a situation in most of rural Asia, if I may put it, where you're looking at the rural vernacular, and I mentioned that because there are a lot of lessons that the rural vernacular provides us for the urban, which is in terms of small prefabricated assembly related materials. And the lessons come from there because in the vernacular you had standardized elements based on what you had in terms of resources, and then you could actually salvage and reuse. So you're re-engineering now that, whether it's interlocking blocks or whether it's concrete products which can be assembled and removed for roofing, or for frames for doors and windows, or timber shingles for roofing material. In Indonesia, you have actually a similar example now where re-engineering salvaged timber for housing. And I wanted to use this example as the last set of slides for the examples coming from my own building in development alternatives in India, which what you see on the top, that red building, was 100% recycled back into the new building, using, in addition, because the floor area is much more, waste from the thermal power plant, like I mentioned. So you have earth bricks that were made from the earth of the first building, and bricks from fly ash, and prefabricated roofing materials. And all of this has led us to a huge amount of material recovery, 80% reduction in the material rucksack by about 50%. We use, as compared to conventional buildings, 30% less steel and cement, so embodied energy goes down. Industrial symbiosis, like I mentioned, construction debris, and of course, then the rest of the systems and services of harvesting water and use. All of this being done through small contractual artisanal skills. So the job creation also comes into picture. If we look at the Asia region and we look at the various the life cycle of the building, we look at design, the materials or resources, where they're coming from, the construction, the use, and the end of life or next life of the building. We see across savings and opportunities, whether it is in the capital cost, whether we're looking at operational costs, environmental impact, new economy business streams across the entire value chain, and also new green jobs and new skills that can emerge from this process. This is probably my last slide, which is, if we are to look at circular systems within the building and construction sector in a context like Asia, these are probably the areas where we need to focus on: construction debris. But I will come back to it, because this is a very, very small part of what we will be able to get. There isn't that much debris that can go back into to the materials that we are looking at, but we definitely must look at resource replacement, substitution, and that might come from the Asian region, from the industrial processes, not necessarily the construction industry, but the other industries like power, like steel making, etc. We have a very large informal sector, and that needs to be brought into the picture. The biomass and renewable materials not yet addressed need to be brought in, because here is where we have the potential for regenerative systems. Because of the scale and the quantum of material required, we will need to look at regenerative systems. We need to look at new technologies. We need to look at IT-based platforms for aggregation of supply, materials, and demand. And we need to look at re-engineering for modularity, for efficiency, durability, and reuse within the vernacular practices. So thank you. I think I managed in time, not bad.
Thank you very much, Zinat, for the intervention, and thank you to all the speakers so far for making the best effort to keep into the time. It's a very, very intense session, and we want to make sure you really enjoy the different presentations and the discussion. And we now move to the next step of our trip, our next destination, and we will have Jeremy Gibbers, who is the director of Gauge, who is going to take us through the African region and his experience of having worked in a number of African countries. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you. What's very interesting and I think useful about the idea of the circular economy for developing countries is it doesn't just offer reduced environmental impacts, a lot of those sorts of issues, but it offers the possibility of improved health, improved job creation, improved opportunities in terms of economics. And I think that's the thing that we need to think about. A lot of the science that we've talked about has been about the environmental issues. We need to think about the potential and the maximization of beneficial impacts. So what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, the situation that's currently hitting a large number of African cities. There's a huge change going on. There's very rapid urbanization. And it's an enormous challenge. A lot of the governments, a lot of society is not able to address that easily. But the solutions, I think, are within the characteristics of existing African built environments. So my suggestion, my argument is that we start there. We look at what's happening and we build and improve on some of the circular aspects that already exist. And then I'm going to just finish off on some ideas of projects that are currently applying the circular economy to the built environment. If we start off with this picture, which is from the Financial Times, what we can see is the massive growth in African cities. This is 100%. So between 2018 and 2035, a lot of these cities are going to double in size. We can think about that in terms of Helsinki. Imagine Helsinki doubling in size within 18 years. Your children's school doubling in size within 18 years. It's a massive issue. And you can see the rest of the world is hovering at around 10, in some cases actually reducing over time. What this results in is it results in enormous informal settlements. The UN calls these slums, and very large proportions of the population living in shacks, in informal dwellings. And again, the scale of this needs to be understood. If we take somewhere like Nigeria, 200 million people, 100 million people in informal settlements. It's an enormous number. And we need to start thinking about how we address this situation. We need to understand informal settlements. This is a project that I worked on St. Paul's in Philippine Cape Town. And it's an amazing situation where a community comes together. They can build a building largely out of scrap or very cheap materials, and this building has made a huge difference. It's after-school activities for children, it's counseling, it's a church, and we need to kind of understand what can be done with very few resources, and look at how we build on some of the existing systems. What we also have, unfortunately, is we have the pressure on building means that sometimes corners get cut. This particular building is a church, televangelist church, that collapsed. 100 people were killed, and the reasons for this were thought to be because an additional floor was put on a building that didn't have sufficient foundations. And so we're finding this type of pressure in the formal economy, as well as in the informal economy. What we also have is we have fantastic indigenous architecture. This is Seroe in Botswana, the village I grew up in, and every material comes from a couple of kilometers for this building. It's thatch, it's mud, timber, cow dung. And these buildings, there's no waste, they're incredibly comfortable, and they work. So again, we need to kind of learn from existing indigenous architecture. So if you move on, what can we do? What are the opportunities? We need to address this informal sector. You know, what do we do in that situation? So I'd suggest that there are very clear opportunities in terms of upgrading and developing informal settlements. We can look at indigenous materials, we can look at indigenous construction, and work with those and improve that. We need to recognize the value of the informal economy. Again, a lot of politicians like to ignore it, they like to sweep it under the carpet, but it is inherently one of the most circular economic systems that exist. They take other people's waste, they add value, and recycle it, reuse it. And the last thing that I want to also talk about is regulations and public-private agreements, is that we need to work far closer together between the private sector and the public sector. So the first one, there's huge opportunities, and it's very interesting, I think, looking at other people's presentations, some of the work going on in the exhibitions, to start developing affordable, modular, circular economic modules in terms of kits, in terms of components for buildings, and making them very widely available, very affordable, and using that to upgrade buildings. A lot of the effort in terms of building can be done by people. They've got those skills, but cost is always an issue. This is a project I did in Kuruman, and what we did here was we used a lot of the kind of indigenous knowledge around earth construction to build very high quality school buildings. And the interesting thing here is through the training process with this, it acted as a catalyst. And a lot of the community who had been living in shacks then went on to build their own very high quality buildings, very low waste buildings, which is the picture on the top. The next thing that we need to understand is the opportunities and how informal economies work. So the top map shows the incredible diversity of services and products in an informal settlement. Those informal settlements survive because everybody works together. They're incredibly intricate systems, and you can get anything in there, from a haircut, creche, a lot of repairs can be done, food, etc. And they're all incredibly linked, tightly linked with each other. So there's very little waste. There's a local economy that works. Any money that comes into that system gets recycled many hundreds of times before it goes out again. So there's huge value that a lot of people ignore. And my argument is that when we look at new settlements, when we look at upgrading settlements, we mustn't design these issues out. We must incorporate them and enhance them within the existing settlements, because there's enormous value, and they are inherently circular. A lot of the informal economy aspects actually do far more work than some of the formal economy systems in developing countries. I'm part of a research project currently that's looking at building regulations globally, but also particularly in Africa. And one of the frightening things is to discover that most of the building regulations are actually colonial. So they haven't changed. 40, 50 years. They're still in gallons. They still talk about things like malaria in places where there hasn't been malaria for 30 years. And so many of the countries are working with a legislative framework and a set of standards that is incredibly old-fashioned. So they need to be updated. And I think the opportunity here is to update them to reflect absolutely best practice in terms of circular economy aspects. Look at much better enforcement, etc. And then the last bit is we are used to, in the construction industry, this conflicting process between the private sector trying to take advantage of government and government trying to minimize the advantage they're taken of. And we need to think far more proactively about collaborative approaches. This is the Department of Environment and Tourism that I worked on, where we built into the contracting process a very strong incentive for very high efficiency in terms of energy, water, renewable energy, waste, etc. And we built that in over a 25-year period. So the collaboration works extremely well. It's won quite a few awards. And I think it's one of the models that we need to look at, is this collaboration using procurement, using agreements to ensure that we get much better built environments. Thank you. That's it.
Jeremy, you left me totally speechless. Spot on. And we'll be moving now to our third destination on our trip to explore how circularity is embedded in the building and construction sector and in the built environment. And we'll now move to Europe, where Barbara de Wolf, who is the Deputy Director General of Business Environment, will lead us to the discovery of that next trip of our destination. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elisa. Good morning, everybody. First of all, maybe I can just explain. Brussels Environment is the Energy and Environment Administration for the Brussels region. We were created 30 years ago, and when the environmental matters were decentralized in Belgium. And during the years, we have seen already our role evolving from end-of-pipe solutions towards becoming more a facilitator for a transition of the economy, including the construction sector. So I will talk about Europe, but also a lot about Brussels, and I think Martin will be pleased, the crucial role of cities in circular economy. We see at EU level that the construction industry is one of the largest industry sectors and responsible for significant economic impacts. 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, 45% of total controlled waste, and 50% of use of material resources. Cities, they have a role in long-term sustainability, but yet today contribute to be big energy consumers and responsible for 80% of CO2 emissions. The built environment is also a big consumer of resources and responsible for a dominant share of greenhouse gas emissions. When taking into consideration the increasing prices of natural resources and EU's dependency on imported natural resources, the situation today is showing that the resources of buildings and the materials are not efficiently used. Real estate developers, they have warned that existing buildings do not match the increasing changes in market demand, so this results in huge building vacancy and loss of value. And that is why Brussels and Europe seeks new solutions to be smarter about the resources while still strengthening our economy. The solution really is to move away from business as usual and towards a circular economy. The EU has led the way by adopting the circular economy package. Many member states and cities and regions across Europe have now adopted their own strategies to make the transition. And the role of cities is worth highlighting. Cities have great potential as they are both large enough to generate flows of secondary materials and resources, but yet small enough to develop efficient management plans on a local scale. We can observe that in all these plans, construction is recognized as a key sector for the transition. So when looking at the waste generated by the classical linear construction sector in Europe today, in most countries, the dominant fraction is mineral waste. Although there are some variations from one country to another, for instance, in Scandinavian countries where more wood is used, but there are also significant variations amongst countries in the management of the waste. Some countries are already achieving high recovery rates, where others turn into landfill, backfilling, or incineration. This, of course, translates into a loss of value. So to improve the management of resources and recover value lost through landfilling, backfilling, or incineration, emphasis has traditionally been put on recycling. The Waste Directive, the EU has set an objective of 70% of recycling of construction and demolition waste. And you can see that a number of member states already achieved this objective, while others are still a long way to go. However, this first loop in the system is not going to be enough. Much of recycling is in fact downcycling and still translates in a significant loss of values. So by transitioning to a circular economy, value is maintained through additional loops of maintenance, reuse, refurbishment, and recycling. In a circular built environment, buildings will no longer be designed for deconstruction, but will be designed for flexibility to allow for change in use, maintenance, and renovation. This increased flexibility translates into a longer life cycle and more positive value for the materials. The light blue line shows the effect of the extension of the life of buildings and the consideration of the values of the materials. So, as part of the BAMP project, Brussels Environment, together with other partners of the consortium, explored the question, what is necessary to make this systematic shift to a circular built environment? It will require at least 3 major changes: a change in design culture, a change in value definition, and a change in collaboration across all all actors. We have some examples, for instance, the National Resource Deal in the Netherlands, which has been signed by more than 325 parties, showing that stakeholder involvement is seen as an essential first step to meet these objectives. At city level, Brussels region can also modestly be seen as a frontrunner. We have developed our regional program for circular economy around 3 objectives. Turn environmental objectives into economic opportunities, anchor the economy in Brussels to produce locally where possible, reduce transport distances, and create added value for Brussels. And thirdly, support job creation. In order to reach these objectives, more than 100 measures were developed in 5 sectors, including, of course, the construction sector. A circular model must consider the buildings as a bank of material. This is considered as being the next logical step. Together with the 2 other Belgian regions, we have developed the Totem tool to assess the life cycle, the environmental impact of buildings and building components through life cycle analysis approach. And in order to reduce construction waste and improve efficient use of materials, we have been coordinator of the BAM project until February 2019. The objectives is really to achieve a circular model by 2050 at our region level. So the main objective for us is to reduce as much as possible the streams of virgin resources entering the regions and the streams leaving the regions. To identify these streams, an urban metabolism analysis has been developed. We also launched a call for Be Circular projects, which gives, in fact, financial support and guidance to local companies for developing circular projects. And amongst all the projects, 21 circular construction sites of diverse typologies have been launched. I mentioned, for instance, the BRIC project, which is a pilot which was reconstructed 3 times, showing a gain of 50% of tons of CO2. So, to conclude, what concrete actions can we develop to move towards a circular model in the construction sector? First of all, we believe a lot in raise awareness through communication awareness actions, support experiments, and lead by examples. We are also a constructor of construction products. We should show the good example. And of course, a next step is to move towards circular public procurement, for instance, by developing standard technical clauses favoring circular economy. On my last slide, I show you the picture of the building where our administration is working. It's an exemplary building because it respects the passive norm for energy efficiency. But I'm not saying that it's an example for a circular building. Still, we have introduced circularity and efficient material we use in the way we consume the building. For instance, we do not only use rainwater, but we also use the grey water circuit. Our furniture, our office furniture, is made of our old, refurbished office tables. They look brand new, but in fact they are more than 20 years old. We also have introduced an ambitious dematerialization program in order to digitalize most of our administrative process. And in our restaurant, the food is produced locally in Brussels, respecting seasonal realities. So you see, circularity can and should be everywhere. So whenever you are in Brussels, please feel free to come and visit us and take part of this circular community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for the last leg of the trip. And allow me to invite the panelists again to the podium. We will be starting now a discussion session. But prior to doing that, let me go and grab my tool to interact with all of you. I'm sure you are by now very familiar with the existence of a function in the app which is the message wall. And through the message wall, you will be able to send me messages on questions or point that you would want me to raise in the course of the discussion with the experts that have just been presenting during the session, and which I please invite to join me here on the panel. And I'll invite two additional experts to be joining us for the panel discussion. Anders Wickman, who is the chairman of Climate Kick, and Hilary Hallo, the vice president of the Uponor Group. Please join me.
Anywhere?
Yes.
Hi, good to see you. I just sent a mail to Ashok. Hi, thank you.
So we'll leave the privilege to the two experts who have just joined us for the panel, Anders and Hilary, to kickstart a little bit the discussion with us and to share with us the impression and their reflections from what they have listened to in the earlier presentation, with their thoughts around how to bring to scale circularity in the built environment context. Anders, would you mind starting, and then Hilary will go
Okay,
next.
Thank you very much. Very, very rich number of presentations. Thank you very much. And showing, on the one hand, the enormous challenges. Just look at it from the point of view of the carbon budget for less than 2 degrees. If we continue business as usual, only the materials carbon budget will exhaust that budget. So we really have enormous challenges, and conditions vary enormously in different parts of the world. I've been close to development alternatives for quite a number of years, so I know how much you have been able to use local materials in your designs, etc., and that came very, very beautifully out. So a lot can happen locally where we shouldn't try to give any advice. Since I live in Sweden and have a background in the OECD countries, let me just say that my experience is that the building and construction industry is very far behind when it comes to all that we have been discussing. It's a very conservative industry. Very little change is going on. Productivity is very low. There is, at least in Scandinavia, too little competition, which also means that there are a few giants that dominate the scene. Their business models, and this is to me the main problem, is not at all long-term. That is to say, there is no responsibility, no incentive for the construction company to build something that will last long, or where you can reuse materials once the building is going to be renovated or finally demolished. And very little recycling, real recycling is going on. There is some recycling going on, but most of what is collected cannot really be used because of design. So the design is not at all taking care of this. Materials are too cheap. I've been asking Skanska, NCC, and other companies, the leadership, how does it come that you waste so much materials? I think you said around 10 to 50% at the construction site. I have figures of 25%. Too much materials purchased and just left as waste, not even being used somewhere else. How can it come? There must be something wrong with the cost structure when things that are of high value are being treated like that. There seems to be no standards within the industry so that we could develop a secondary materials market. And the financial market, for instance, is not giving any kind of benefit for material use. Quite often nowadays, they give lower rates for energy-efficient buildings, but material-efficient buildings are not really being looked into. So I would tend to say that we have to put in place regulation which looks at design criteria. I have an example. I'm chairing something called Circular Sweden. We have one of the major flooring companies, Tarkett, as one of our members. The guy representing them, he said at the other day in a meeting, if the government told us that we should have 20 or 30 or 40% of used materials in the flooring, we would do that. But as long as there is no regulation, we will not do it. And I would like to do it, he said, but my financial department will not do it. Because it's normally a bit more expensive to use secondary materials than virgin materials. So I think we need design criteria, and we need, of course, to combine that with public procurement. So again, we end up at the upstream. Don't fool yourself that enhancing recycling criteria will help much, because what we collect with present design is not of much value. So we have to combine this with design criteria. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anders. Hilary, may I ask also your reflections?
Yes, of course, and thanks for having me here, by the way. I can just pick up from where Anders left off, because I think I more or less completely agree with everything that was said, except for the fact that you said that materials are too cheap, because being a material manufacturer, our customers complain of quite the contrary. I don't understand why, because I do agree that they are too cheap. At least we get paid too little for them. Let's start with this design aspect first. Yes, downstream recycling is not going to solve the problem for two reasons. One is this aspect that you mentioned, that because of the way we design, most of the stuff that we end up getting from construction sites or demolition sites are unusable because they were never designed for recycling. The other reason why recycling, focusing on recycling at end of life only, is not going to solve the problem, and this is one of my favorite topics. When we do buildings and construction products that live for 50 or 80 or 100 or 120 years, and we try to solve the problems that we currently have with circularity by focusing on end-of-life recycling, we seem to believe that the society will be exactly like today, 120 years down the line. I don't believe for a moment that we will have the same society. So I think we are putting our resources a bit on the wrong basket if we assume that whatever we now build in is going to be valuable for someone 120 years down the line. Much more important is designing for dismantling so that the products themselves can be reused, not recycled, and designing for long and flexible lifetimes, which will sort of use, in a way, buildings as a repository of material rather than a temporary bank. Now, one of the things that I picked up from the regional presentations was this notion of utilizing other industries' waste streams as building material, which is in a way self-evident, but it's positive to note that, because I think that by just considering circularity within the construction industry or the built environment, we are also not going to get that far. I think this is a more systemic and cross-sectoral problem. Even if somebody said that somebody used the word downcycling in a little bit negative sense, I think it was you, Barbara. With the amount of challenge that we now have in terms of circularity, I personally don't think we should be too afraid of downcycling as the first step towards a more circular built environment. If we wait for a perfect solution for immediate reuse and recycling, I think we will waste too much time on that. So downcycling is okay utilizing construction industry's waste streams for other, maybe even shorter lifespan products, but for a productive use, I think is all fine and good. Even more important, coming from a company that deals quite a lot with plastic raw materials for building products, I think we have a huge opportunity in tackling the short lifetime consumer plastic goods waste streams by getting our hands on them, incorporating them into long lifetime products, and instead of putting plastics in waste to energy or to landfill, using again buildings as a repository for the waste streams that we are in any case generating. The third thing that I wanted to pick up, and this is, I'm sorry that I'm ending a little bit on a pessimistic note. Many of you used the word systemic change in the presentations, and if there's an industry that doesn't have a good track record in systemic change, it's unfortunately ours. It has to do with the well-grounded, traditional linear value chain. So we have raw material extraction, we have some of us that turn those raw materials into products, and then we have a whole host and very fragmented downstream value chain to turn them into buildings. And when the value chain is linear and very, very fragmented, systemic change is pretty difficult to achieve. Hopefully we can do that. One bit, there was one word that I didn't hear in any of the presentations, and actually I haven't heard in any of the circular building and built environment discussions so far, and that's the role that building product and material distributors and wholesalers could play in this. I mean, most of the products and raw materials go through a professional distribution channel. It's not us that deliver it on the construction site. It's also not us that could play a role in actually collecting waste streams and refining them into useful fractions of raw material. So I would be very glad to see the distributors and wholesalers playing a bigger role in this. Are there any distributors or wholesalers in the room? Well, there you go. Just proved my own point.
Thank you very much, Hilary. I'll allow a small reaction from Anders prior to going back to the regional.
No, I just wanted to add one thing, that what I found when I take part in seminars in architect schools and among builders, construction companies, that they sort of all say, well, if circularity is the new objective, we believe there is going to be a lot of innovation. And I believe the same, but they have not had their minds directed towards that. So I think innovation is going and has to play a major role, as well as material substitution. I mean, I come from a country with a lot of forestry, yet we only build around 10% of the new buildings, high-rise buildings in wood. Yet they are less expensive to build. They are, in my opinion, much more beautiful. And you prolong the carbon sink from the forest into society for many, many decades. So, I mean, and of course, this is easy to say in a forested country, but you have bamboo in many developing countries, which is a fantastic material for construction. So there are many, many ways we can innovate us out of this conundrum, where concrete and steel seems to be the major materials, and produced in a way that generates so much emissions.
Thank you very, very much. I'd like to pick one of the points that both your intervention touched upon, which is the embedding circularity upstream from the design phase. And I wanted to hear a reaction from the experts who have brought out this perspective from different regions on how they see these materializing in the context of their regions. Maybe, Zinat, would you feel like starting?
Yeah, I think I did touch upon it, and in fact it reflects in what the comments have come from both Anders and Hilary, that if we look at the Asian context, and we said we are looking at fast-growing urban spaces, fast-growing settlements, dense settlements, and end of pipe is not going to solve the answer. In fact, there's a study that was done for India which said that if we were to recycle every bit, 100% of the construction debris, we are not going to be solving the new resource requirement more than 2%. And it makes so it's a great idea for waste management. It's not the best idea for the new resource that we need, so we are looking at resource substitution. And construction debris reuse is fantastic for situations like earthquakes, etc., where you suddenly have a huge quantum in the same place, and it's desirable that you don't get more new material, but it's not. So that's one point. The second point, which in fact Anders just made, is that we have had a tradition of biomass and bamboo and re-engineering bamboo. There's a lot of innovation happening there. We need to address that, because that is the regeneration end, and that is, in my view, maybe not right now, but 10 years down the line, that is the future that we need to. And the third point, again, learning from the vernacular. If you see, a lot of our old systems used standardized modules, and that's why in the older buildings that are being pulled apart, you can salvage and reuse full elements without additional processing energy that goes into it. So we need to look at material components that can be assembled and disassembled, interlocking blocks, easily put together systems. Unfortunately, the construction industry in prefabrication is going large. What we need to do is modulate for small. And this is really at the design end that the Asian perspective should come in.
Jeremy, would you want to add from your perspective to this idea of embedding it upstream in the design phase?
I mean, I think the assumption is that someone's designing. There's a professional team. The examples I gave you is that 50% of the built environment don't have designers. So I think we have to kind of think a little bit more laterally, that we can't just influence a few architects and we're going to get a circular result. So we need to stand back a little bit in terms of planning, and I think Martin made the point about thinking holistically about environments. It's not just about materials and recycling. We need to think much more holistically about work, health, education. And I think if we embed that
and mobility
in the planning, mobility within the planning, we've gotten a long way. So I think, in terms of a lot of these kind of very large informal settlements, we can embed and we can transform that in planning. The second part is that I think we can redesign the system. So I am agreeing with you that the design plays a role, but it's the system and the availability of materials, it's the affordability of materials, it's the ease at which they can be obtained and put together. And I think that's what makes a difference. If we look at all of these informal settlements, it's whatever materials are available, people will use, and what's affordable. And I think part of the transformation is that we can change the playing field, is that we can use government procurement, we can use subsidies, we can use taxes to make circular economic materials far more affordable and readily available. And it'll happen naturally. People will use them instead of, poorer materials or, materials that, have a lot of negative effects. So I think we need to kind of think of it as a system, and I think we need to think of it as neighborhoods, really, and make sure that those neighborhoods work at that level in terms of circular economy, and then we can use design.
Excellent. Barbara?
Yes. I pretty much agree already with what the previous speaker said, so maybe it's a good occasion to react on what you said about the negative feeling I gave about downcycling. Maybe I just have to explain in what context I told it. It was based on a pilot that we did in the BAM project, a building in Amsterdam, which in less than 20 years was deconstructed because it was no longer corresponding to the needs of the market. And that's why design is so important, and why it's important to develop and to help the sector develop tools and guidelines in design and create extra value. Because of course, recycling is still a good thing, and we will always have construction and demolition waste which we will, of course, try to foster to recycling. But it is these needs of the markets which should also be covered with buildings which can be reconstructed more.
Well, that was a perfect addition, because in my books, the worst thing that we can create is redundant space that doesn't serve anything, and then end up demolishing that. So yes, design for flexibility and long service life and adaptability to future uses, that I think is one of the most important things.
Thank you very much. And I'll move to Martin, and I'll actually change a little bit the scope of the question, and I would want to go a little bit more in depth with you on where you see the biggest opportunities for bringing to scale circularity in the building and construction sector. Where do you see are the most important button we should press to really promote that transformation of the sector?
I mean, we talked about how to create new environments. That's the big theme, and I think that I heard that a lot. And by the way, I was really impressed by the regional examples, so I'm not sure, I was quite blown away by how much and how vivid and how tangible it is. We can talk about that and all the positive effects that comes from linking how we live, how we move, how we use water, how we use nutrients, how we use energy, and to pull this together into something that works. But the narrower question that you apply to is sort of how to do that with construction materials, and it's so puzzling that that we are taking 40 gigatons of that into use every year without a good idea of what to do after one use cycle. And so it goes all back to your point of how can we actually design something with it that has a value afterwards. And perhaps here we need to be a bit more discriminative, perhaps we need to differentiate a bit more, I'm seeing Nora there, between defined use and defined use periods. I think we need to differentiate a bit more between the duration of the building and the duration of use, which is getting ever shorter, and we need to perhaps distinguish a bit more between the shell and the interior of a building. So, and here, in fact, there are a couple of trends that are coming towards us. We do know that the turnover on our building stock is very, very fast, and they are very, very individualized demand of how we are using it. And at the same time, we know that a lot of that is about interior. And at the same time, we know if we are unable to describe for what kind of world we are designing our materials, then no one will take any interest in doing it differently. We do know that financial markets are very, very poor in treating or dealing or steering anything that's beyond 20 years. There's no discount rate small enough to let anything look important that is beyond 20 years. And so I think there's a couple of interesting things happen. One of the companies that are pointed as was Dirt, which is an interesting name to choose for your company, which essentially is modularizing all the interior of offices, or of commercial buildings. So it's much you are much more able, first of all, to drive utilization up because it's fluid, it can breathe. You can update it, and once you update it, you can basically take all the interior back into new use because it has been designed for it. And I think there's a lot of opportunity that sits in that, and that takes us well onto this side of the 20 years. We still need to have an answer for everything that happens beyond 20 years, and I think we are still not quite clear in our heads whether we want long-living buildings or whether we don't want them. I think I live in a 500-year-old house. I find that quite fascinating. I think long-living buildings are a wonderful thing. At the same time, if we know that how the world is changing so fast, having buildings that have a defined use period, and you know when, under what circumstances, within what industrial context will you be recollecting the materials, would be very helpful.
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I really want to make sure I can capture from you as experts what should be the next actions that, in a platform such as the one of the Sustainable Building and Construction Program, which has a global reach and is going to be building on your reviews, what should be the priorities that program should be focusing on to really create the conditions for a circular built environment? And I'll ask you one or two really top priority topics that should be part of the agenda of the program. Hilary, may I start with you and we go around the whole panel?
Sure. I don't know if this is the top priority topic that I can think about, but I picked it up from something that you guys just said, which is this interesting combination of the industry going off-site and prefab, possibly large scale, but we us, in a way, having the need to localize that. So how do we design a business which is built on volumes, which is built on modularity and off-site construction for material efficiency and quality improvement and so forth, but still able to do that based on, for example, the locally available materials?
Fantastic. So it touches on the design, it touches on the local economy development, and it brings the idea of modularity and efficiency in the use of resources. Zina.
I think if I were to pick up one, then I would look at public procurement, which has, and within public procurement, disclosures of the material, the embodied energy, and the social job creation, footprints and handprints. I think the job creation is much more of a handprint than a footprint. Disclosed by product manufacturers and build standards around that.
Okay, well, quite a big one. It went on developing.
It's a big one, but I think it's public procurement that can really push this in the supply chain end.
With clear requirements associated with it that are building on industry standards.
Absolutely.
And touching upon both the environmental and the social dimension.
Absolutely.
Anders.
Well, this will probably not apply for the kind of environments where you are, but I strongly think that we need a tax reform in society. If I look at Europe today, we tax the use of natural resources, including energy, between 5 and 6% of GDP. Labor is taxed between 55 and 60% of GDP, and the rest is VAT and property taxes. It's an absurd ratio. And even if some of your customers tell you that the materials are too expensive, they are too cheap. It's too cheap to use nature. And as long as this is the case, I think we are going to have an uphill battle. So that is one thing. The other thing is, I picked up one thing when I was reviewing public procurement legislation in Sweden a few years ago. I sat with some of the biggest construction companies in Europe and we discussed public procurement. And then one of the CEOs said all of a sudden, well, you know, when we build something that we are then going to manage, a building that where we are going to be the manager for the next 20, 30 years, the quality is much higher. And that was very revealing to me. So we must do something to change the business models, to give the business models an orientation towards long-term responsibility.
Thank you very much, Anders. So something in conjunction with taxes and making sure we really embed the cost of the nature that we're using, but also rethinking a little bit the responsibility that is around not only the construction, but also the operation of the built environment. Jeremy.
I think it's interesting if we look at this conference as a whole. There's lots of different fields and sectors. We're covering food, we're covering all sorts of different things. In the end, built environments are the framework that make all of that work or not work. So if we think about, circular economy food systems, if that food is not readily available within your neighborhood, you aren't going to buy it. You're not going to go further. So I think part of what we really need to understand is how neighborhoods, how people work, how people live, and we build an enabling framework for the circular economy. And I think until we understand that properly, it's not going to work. It's going to be fragmented. We're going to look at materials, we're going to look at food separately, and the system isn't going to work. So fundamentally, I think we need to go back to basics and say, how do our built environments, our neighborhoods work in order to ensure that the circular economy options are real options. I think the one other thing is the local economy is incredibly important because you live with your impacts. And there's quite an interesting standard in South Africa, which is a local economy standard, and government is driving that through procurement. And I think, the science around that and supporting that, you build all sorts of small businesses, local businesses, and I think there's a lot of potential with that.
Thank you very much. Barbara and Martin, I don't want to be unfair, but we are exceeding a little bit the time of the session, so I'll ask you to be brief in your recommendations to the program.
Okay, I will just add another one, so then we can complete the picture. I really believe a lot in sharing of information, of sharing best practices, and working on dissemination. I just want to make a comparison, because I have a response for the very conservative construction sector. What we did with the passive standard for energy efficiency. First, we did a lot of exemplary calls, so that we had a network of pilots working to show that it works, and after that we made it mandatory, and they participated, it worked, so that's important, dissemination.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Martin.
I wish there was one circular, high-quality, dignified community in one of the fast-growing communities in Africa, which is too nice and too good for not everyone else to copy.
We'll build it.
Yeah.
So for next forum, we'll know a little bit more about the community that was built around the idea of circularity. And I thank you very much for all the ideas and all the inspiration that you have shared on the panel, and the audience for the very interesting question that I've been trying to weave into the discussion. You will see on the slide how to connect with the Sustainable Building and Construction Program and take advantage for more sharing of experience. And again, let me thank you all by an applause, to which I'll ask the public to join me.